Right, good afternoon, everybody. I want to welcome you to David's second lecture. But before doing so, I also want to introduce, Adam Chow asked me to introduce lectures by Leonard Bleuset from Leiden University, who is a Dutch sinologist working on Taiwan. There's a beautiful poster. And there will be a first lecture on next Monday at 5 p.m. On early modern Taiwan as a laboratory of colonial society, and that is in FAME's Effective Asian Middle Eastern Studies in room 8 and 9. And the second lecture follows after our symposium. We're going to end at 5 o'clock. Then you can have a tea break, and at 6 o'clock you can go listen to Leonard Bleuset about the discovery of northern and eastern Taiwan's Aboriginal societies. So with that, I have done my duty for Adam, I hope. And so David is going to give his second lecture, which I think is very much at the heart of his current project, the stuff he has been working on. The title of that lecture is The Lyrical in Epic Times on Modern Chinese Literary Thought. And just to remind you, in the first lecture, so last Tuesday, David posed the question of how what can be called, I think, the Mara dilemma worked itself through 20th century Chinese literature. And the Mara dilemma refers to sort of Lu Xun's reference to a Mara poet was in 1908. And Mara is a Sanskrit demon god who was both destructive and constructive, or thought of destruction as possibly leading to construction. And that dilemma working itself through 20th century Chinese literature, and we talked about, I'm going to get my facts straight here, but that sort of worked itself through sort of a generation of writers who committed themselves to communism, and he compared it to the homunculus phenomenon. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, and that derived from Goethe, sort of a group of authors who committed themselves to communism as a way of protecting, of perhaps leading towards a better China in the future. And we ended with a discussion of the Nobel dilemma, in which a later generation, the current generation of Chinese authors had to struggle, and which sort of was resolved in a way by the award of two Nobel prizes, first to Gao Xingjian and then to Mo Yan, both leading to controversy, but also to sort of a letting go of that dilemma. Today, David is going to talk about really how he's going to talk about how we should talk about modern Chinese literary thought, or what that might mean, how these concepts of literary theory and so on, how these might work, how we might utilize those to talk about Chinese literature in the 20th century. And the way that I sort of, from your description, the way that I would sort of begin to understand that is, how should we situate literary praxis in China? How do we try to conceive of that? That's a huge question, which can lead to all kinds of interesting thoughts about sort of Western literature, Chinese literature, literary theory, and so on. And so to keep us busy with that for the next hour, please welcome David. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Again, this is my pleasure to be back to give the second of my lecture series. The topic for today is the lyrical in epic time, with a subtitle on modern Chinese literary thought. In this lecture, I would like to deal with the way modern Chinese literati and intellectuals came to terms with the meaning and the function of literature in a broad sense, vis-a-vis historical turmoil and political atrocities. This is definitely a rather huge topic, and yet it's highly relevant to our concerns, particularly as a practitioner of modern Chinese literary studies. Given the limited amount of time today, I am going to focus upon one specific time frame, that is China in the mid-20th century. This is definitely a period filled with events from the Second Sino-Japanese War to 1949 national divide, followed by this huge diaspora. More than 2 million Chinese fled China to overseas Chinese communities. And then movements, campaigns, purges, and so on and so forth culminated in the outbreak of the Great Cultural Revolution. In between, also, China underwent a mysterious famine whose consequences were yet to be released to our knowledge, even to date. So definitely, this is a tumultuous moment for our concern. And yet, the topic for today, the lyrical, at least part of the topic, the lyrical, seems kind of equivocal because for our general understanding of this term, lyrical usually refers to sentimentalized subjectivity or rhapsodic flight into somewhere, nowhere. This is a beautiful, bucolic, pastoral, or whatever terminology you want to use, describing a kind of euphonic state of mind in poetic composition. By the way, this is a very lyrical day. The weather is good, and I have to confess that I had a lyrical time yesterday. I went bunting, and for Cambridge PhD students offered this punting right, and they punted. I didn't. I was sitting there enjoying very happily. I mention this because this is in a way relevant to our topic. That is 1928, on the same river can, Xu Zhimo, arguably the most popular Chinese lyrical poet, was right on the river, and as a result of the punting, he composed Farewell Again, Cambridge, arguably still the most memorable poem in modern Chinese poetry. And yet, today, I am going to move the time point, 1928, forward to 1948, to the eve of the Chinese Communist Revolution. I'm going to introduce a group of literati and writers who were trying to make a hard decision on the eve of the impending revolution, whether they should conform to this great call for revolution, call to arms in Lu Xun's terminology, or they actually have to make their own decisions as to the future of either the nation of their own or of their own career. And there's a kind of a bifurcation in terms of in a lyrical decision made in an epic time would be the topic I would like to look into. But before I go directly toward the subject matter, that is a group of writers writing during the time and thinking at the time about the meaning and the function of literature, let me just first digress a little bit by talking about the subtitle of today's lecture, that is literary thought. And here, by literary thought, I meant to juxtapose the term with literary theory. And literary theory here, for me, means an institutionalized discourse, particularly in Western academia, particularly in North America. A kind of a discourse aimed at explaining, contemplating, rationalizing, and generalizing the meaning of literature in relation to a multitude of human concerns. To make this terminology simpler, let me just say, nowadays in a literature classroom, probably still in North America, it has become a commonplace for us to talk about, say, Lu Xun or Shenzhongwen, who I'm going to introduce very soon, in terms of a grand series of Western theories. It has become a commonplace for us to talk about, say, gender theory, talking about biopolitics, something really trendy and up to date. And it has become truly a kind of sort of a mandate for literature majors to talk about structuralism, 1970s, deconstruction, 1980s, post-colonialism or postmodernism in every possibility, 1990s. And then we have empire studies. We also have Orientalism. We have digital philosophy, which too is quite popular nowadays. And above all, Marxism still there, ever enchanting our imagination. So truly, this is a kind of an age of a theory, so to speak. And the trend sort of started as early as the late 1960s, and it peaked in 1990s. And by the end of the 1990s, even a Chinese literature program, again, let me emphasize that, I mean particularly in North America, Canada perhaps, I think it's not really happening that powerfully in Britain, whatever. But anyway, students are supposed to come to a classroom to talk about Lu Xun and his white blood cell count. I don't know what that linkage really means, but it definitely is a functioning topic for students to engage in. You want to talk about computer sciences in relation to the literary practice in whatever sense. You want to talk about gender, you want to talk about transvestism, and so on and so forth. So truly, this is a moment of a heteroglossia in terms of theoretical approaches to literary text. The theory here is not criticism. If criticism means merely a kind of individual engagement, a kind of a critique of a specific text or phenomenon, literature, in terms of a literary theory, always try to generalize, always try to put together a grandiose discourse through which to engage issues beyond the immediate reach of literary engagement, writing or reading, and so on and so forth. So in the domain of Chinese literary studies, particularly modern Chinese literary studies, we are used to names together with Lu Xun or Shenzhongwen and so on and so forth. We are used to names such as Michel Foucault or Derrida or Deleuze and Guattari or Mikhail Bakhtin, all foreign-sounding names. And Britain has its own share, Stuart Hall, who passed away last year, right? And of course, the founding father of post-colonial studies. And of course, Edward Said, Walter Benjamin, you can name it on and on. So this has become a kind of a sort of a common phenomenon. And this phenomenon is now also is being understood and being put into practice even on the mainland and other Sinophone communities, such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, and so on and so forth. I must confess that I play a minor role in making such a kind of a literary theoretical boom in the Sinophone world. As early as the 1980s, I translated Michel Foucault's The Archaeology of Knowledge. And in the late 1980s, I introduced Mikhail Bakhtin's Theory of a Carnival to the Chinese world. And my students even could tell from my early books. They said, hey, Professor Wang, this sounds like a book you wrote during your structuralist period. And the next one, this sounds like a book inspired by Bakhtin, and so on and so forth. So here, I am not trying to say anything to deny or to denigrate the function, the valence of literary theory. I think it is a useful critical tool. And I think it is, particularly in terms of, say, a pedagogical vehicle. Theory, or in a minor scale of theory, literary criticism, has played a very, very useful kind of a role in helping students to get to know a text, to understand a certain historical or literary circumstance. Or literary theory should be credited for making literature a kind of interdisciplinary experimentation. Nowadays, the theoreticians always want to argue that with literature as our point of departure, we want to go beyond, to really engage ourselves with all kinds of phenomena in our society. So you see literature everywhere, which seems to be a good sign, so interdisciplinary study. And above all, for some of my very progressive colleagues, they want to see literary theory being put into practice, being kind of a provocative in terms of instigating whatever kind of a provocation or even campaign or action in social and political sense. So on that side of literary theoretical engagement, I think we are already already in this kind of circumstance. Just like I'm dressed in Western sort of dress code, that's part of me, and there is no way for me to say no to such a kind of a fashion or tradition or such a kind of a code. But there must be a moment, or at least for me, there was a moment when I came to realize the limitation of literary theory. After having introduced Foucault or Derrida to my students for so many years, I came to realize my own, say, a shortage of knowledge or even awareness of Chinese literary legacy. Although I was born Chinese, although I teach modern Chinese literature, but how come in classroom, in English, I'm teaching theories, mostly traveling from Europe? So this is something I came to reflect upon probably 15 years ago. At that time, I don't want to use a word like a crisis or whatever. I somehow just felt maybe I should be able to do something more. If I were teaching in the United States, I should really familiarize my students, perhaps to a certain extent, my colleagues from other national literature departments, to know better about this great legacy or heritage of modern Chinese literary learning. So that was a sort of beginning of my sort of turn to this tremendous fortune of pre-modern Chinese literary thought. And this is where I would like to define what I mean by literary thought. Literary theory, now we are familiar with all the terminologies. We are familiar with all these generic attributions. You read theories, you buy books at bookstores, and you write in the hope that eventually your articles be published in journals such as PMLA and Harvard Journal of Asiatic Studies and so on and so forth. But when we come to literary thought, I probably have to say, this is in the words of my colleague, Steve Owen, this is a group of diverse texts, which in turn belong to distinct genres. Literary thought tries to explain the role literature plays in a civilization, and to describe literature and literary works in terms that have resonance in other areas of intellectual and social life. In a way, literary thought refers to the kind of engagement, critical or theoretical engagement, which cannot be bogged down to a kind of a rigorous discourse. You sometimes find some kind of interesting thought, literary thought, in correspondence between writers or a writer and a critic. Sometimes you find jottings on the part of writers in private. Sometimes you come across a literary thought in a kind of a poetic or fictional statement. So literary thought refers to this kind of amorphous kind of a corpus of the statements or manifestations regarding the possibilities and sometimes impossibilities of engaging with literature at a specific historical moment. In other words, if literary theory tries to generalize literary phenomenon, always in a kind of ahistorical kind of a manner. Literary thought tries to bring the very factor of historical contingency into consideration. It also highlights the generic hybridity in the practice of literature, either on the imaginative side or on the theoretical side. There shouldn't be such a kind of rigid formula or form to speak of when we come to the notion of literary thought. And perhaps because of such a kind of a sort of form of existence, it becomes difficult for us to describe what the literary thought really means or how it functions in the contemporary context of academic discipline. As I said, if nowadays I just jot down some kind of prose-like literary thought about the lyrical in epic time, I probably would never be able to find a publisher in any publishing, university publishing presses, at least in the United States. Or I probably won't be able to convince my students of the valence of these thoughts. And still, nevertheless, it is my belief that we can and we should bring literary thought to bear upon the existence, the current paradigm of literary theory. If we are really treating Chinese literary study seriously, particularly for the students of modern Chinese literature, shouldn't we at least try a little bit to understand the legacy or the heritage of the bygone efforts invested in literary creation, practice, or criticism or critique? So that probably gives the framework of today's report. And still, as I will argue in the following, this is a huge topic, and for today, I am only concentrating upon one specific period. And I will highlight one single author, and again, this particular author's engagement can be described as the lyrical in epic time. But before I move on, just to repeat what I said on Tuesday, for Chinese students or students of Chinese literature, 文学 or literature, it's really not a perfect equivalent here, but at least the 文学 in the Chinese context, etymologically speaking, this 文 means ornamentation, belles lettres, learning and scholarship, cultural propensity, a kind of specific cultural bearings, and above all, civilization. So it is in this broad context that we come to deal with this specific case I would like to elaborate upon in the next 40 minutes. So the first part has to do with this gentleman, Mr. Shenzhongwen. He was born in 1902 and he passed away in 1988. On Tuesday, I actually featured him just momentarily, but I just saved the Shenzhongwen for today's lecture. So I really didn't talk much about who he was or what he did. But for one thing, probably if we're harboring some kind of a Nobel complex, in 1988, Shenzhongwen was one of the nominees for the Nobel Prize. And he almost could have won it had he not passed away too soon before the announcement of the prize. So this is how he was being understood and appreciated by the Nobel Prize Committee. What I'm going to introduce for today in terms of a literary thought is 有情的历史. Again, in English, a history with feeling. What does this mean, and why it can be understood as a kind of literary thought rather than as a literary theory? That's what I'm going to describe in the following. Now, just to refresh your memory, on Tuesday, when I talked about Shenzhongwen, I talked about him as one of the most popular writers in late 1930s, as a leading newspaper literary supplement editor. And he discovered many young literary talent, and he himself was best known for his lyrical chronicling of his hometown region, southwestern part of Hunan, southwestern China. And he's arguably the most important writer of Chinese regionalism. When the war, Second Sino-Japanese War, broke out, Shenzhongwen, just like many of his colleagues, fled to the hinterland, southwestern part of China, to avoid the dire consequences of a Japanese occupation in Beijing. And he then spent 8 years in Yunnan, and he was a professor at Southwestern Associated University, Xinan Lianda. And this is another picture just showing you, of course, of some of the fans of Shenzhongwen's fiction. You surely know the wonderful romance between Shenzhongwen and his wife, Zhang Zhaohe, the picture they took in 1933, and a picture they took in 1945, 12 years after. So this is a kind of a wholesome family, at least judging by the picture they took in 1945. And yet, in the next 4 years, this family was going to undergo a tremendous political storm. So much so that family almost was being destroyed when, on the eve of the Chinese Communist Revolution. So here, I want to only highlight a couple of specific moments. In 1948, 20 years right after Xu Zhimo was punting on River Cam. And lyricism was being now regarded as the forbidden topic. China, 1948. How can one still talk about the lyrical? This is supposed to be an epic time. The revolution is coming, and everybody is supposed to pledge allegiance to this new communist or socialist solidarity. Shenzhongwen, however, happened to have a different take upon the conditions of Chinese revolutionary modernity. He felt, given these political circumstances, a writer, an intellectual, or an artist was still entitled to make his or her own decision in light of her own artistic and intellectual vocation. And for Shenzhongwen, lyricism happens to be the magic word. He wants to stay with his lyrical practice with regard to Chinese reality. And yet, such a practice, such a kind of adherence to lyricism turned out to be a most unlikely sort of commitment. So that in March 1948, there were already lots of attacks, particularly one particular attack launched by Guo Moruo, we talk about him on Tuesday, on Shenzhongwen, describing him as a kind of a sort of reactionary writer, as a writer who indulged himself in pornographic writing. We don't know how that happened, but that's Guo Moruo, right? And by the end of that year, Shenzhongwen was already showing signs of a nervous breakdown. He has hallucinations, he had all kinds of signs of paranoia, and so on and so forth, all right? And then next year, as I said the other day, when the PLA sort of came into Beijing city, the majority of Beijing civilians were welcoming this change of the political circumstances in the ancient city. Shenzhongwen now was left alone to ponder this unwise choice he seems to have made. And then the situation became worse and worse. Finally, on March 28, 1949, one afternoon, when Shenzhongwen's wife and the two children happily went to a new school established for those progressive young men and young women to train them to become a newer generation of revolutionaries, Shenzhongwen was left behind, and he turned the radio in his studio very, very loud. The music happened to be Beethoven's music, all right? And then he took out his razor blade. He slit his own throat, his own wrists, and also he drank kerosene. He wanted to die, and he almost died. And luckily, later that afternoon, one of his cousins came by, and it's just by pure luck. Shenzhongwen was spared this suicidal attempt, and then he went into total mental breakdown. So for the next 2 months, Shenzhongwen was put in Qinghua Yuan, all right, the Qinghua Garden. It's actually part of a campus of Tsinghua University now, for a retreat, for rehabilitation. And then on May 30th, at night, 10 o'clock in Beiping, in the dorm, 1949, he jot down something like this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but basically you probably could read on the screen. Everything at home appears as tranquil as ever. The radio was still broadcasting beautiful Western symphonic melodies. My dear kids were deep in sleep. I come to think of my wife. She was such a wonderful lady. I love her so much. Everything looked so calm, so quiet. But here, the fourth line from the bottom. The world has changed. Everything has lost its meaning. I've been thrown into a world of oblivion, isolated from all happiness. I don't understand what makes me so sad while I am facing the world aimlessly. This was a devastating statement, right? Just right before the founding of the new People's Republic of China, Shenzhongwen wrote such a kind of a depressing thing to think about his own future, which he described as aimless. And this is definitely unforgivable. And then 2 months later, in July, when the first Congress of Chinese Literary and cultural workers was being held in Beijing, Shenzhongwen was denied membership to this huge sort of national congress. And in that Congress, Feng Zhi, the person I talked about on Tuesday, happened to be vice president. So you could see, once upon a time, they were colleagues, and now they surely parted the way with each other now because of the new political circumstances. The fact was actually worse than just mere denial, his membership to this new Congress of Chinese writers and artistic workers. And in 1950, next year, Shenzhongwen simply was told that he had better not to engage in writing anymore, because this new regime needs a new kind of writing, new group of writers. And Shenzhongwen was regarded as a reactionary, as naive about this wonderful new utopian prospect of the new regime. And as a matter of fact, his position at the Beijing University was terminated, and he was transferred to the National Museum of History to serve as a clerk, all right, as a kind of a clerk to collect items and transcribe the pictures and the information of all these items. And that was his profession for the next 3 decades. All right? So this is the first part of the story. So once upon a time, millions of readers, were reading Shenzhongwen's fiction about this idyllic and lyrical eternal dreamland we call the Western Hunan, Xiangxi, border town and so on and so forth. And now he was simply told that all the good old plates for publication, right, for printing, were being destroyed. No more writing, that's that. So that seems to sort of bring the first part of Shenzhongwen's story, the life story, to a conclusion. But the story went on. Now I'm going to the second sort of a moment for Shenzhongwen's decision. The time now was January 25th, 1952. Earlier that year, the Chinese government, in order to train or re-educate these reactionary writers and the literature workers, organized a kind of a tour to Sichuan province. So Shenzhongwen was picked as one of not so wonderful or so desirable social elements. So he was put on the tour, and he went to Sichuan to observe the wonderful outcome of land reform in the local areas. On that night, January 25th, 1952, the whole team of observers took a shelter or took a lodging actually in Neijiang. It's a small county in Sichuan. And that night, when most of his colleagues went out for a stroll for some kind of entertainment, Shenzhongwen was left behind to guard the house where they stayed for that night. And when it was getting rather late, 9 or 10 o'clock, he couldn't sleep. He was tossing around in bed. And he heard the mice running around in the roof. He also heard the coughing of an old couple living next door. And most unbearably, babies crying, right? Just all kind of a noise. Couldn't sleep. And this moment, out of a boredom, he just tried to kill his time by taking a look of a book, an abridged edition of Shiji, 400篇, the record of the historian, the so-called the quintessential historiography in ancient China. And where did he get this book? From trash next door, just a couple of days before. And he just rescued the book from the trash. Then he thumbed through the book, and he came to realize that this is a familiar book, a familiar text. And yet, at this particular moment, he had some kind of a new insight into the gist of this particular text. Here, again, I have the English translation of what he wrote, actually in the form of a family letter to his wife. So this is not any famous literary treatise or whatever, but this is just a kind of a letter Shenzhongwen sent to Zhang Zhaohe. Here, Shenzhongwen argued that reading through the ancient historiography, 史记, he came to realize that the biographies part, 列传 part, really were still very moving. Almost 2,000 years after the completion of the book. Still, the figures being described in the historiography came to him as if they were still alive. And Shenzhongwen was so moved by his reading that he came to such a kind of observation. The discourse of a feeling, that's what he described as a 有情的历史, as opposed to the discourse of actions, 事功的历史. All too often have we been overwhelmed with the history of actions, revolutions, the founding of republics and another republic, all kinds of political engagements, battles, all kinds of campaigns and movements. History was of actions. But there is another kind of a history we call the history of a feeling, which has been overlooked by modern Chinese, generation after generation. And Shenzhongwen argues that here our primary task is to rescue this history with feeling from the history of actions. 从有情的历史里面再重新了解事功的历史. Then he talked about the conditions. Please take a look at the red part of the quote, and I'll explain in English. Actions, or 事功, are easy to understand and easy to perceive and describe and capture. But 有情的历史 is such a kind of obscure form. What is the 有情的历史? And how do we come to terms with this particular kind of history? For Shenzhongwen, only when a writer whose life has come to the stage of total maturity, who has been through the ups and downs, pains and sorrows and the sufferings, and then he comes to realize the core of the feeling that substantiates the meaningfulness of history. And for Shenzhongwen, this history with feeling can be best crystallized in the form of literature. So that's for him, still literature means something, still literature works something in the given circumstances. And of course, most of Shenzhongwen's colleagues and his former students wouldn't have understood what he was up to. And indeed, this is a family letter, as I said, which was a sort of received by Shenzhongwen's wife, who happened to be very progressive, very sympathetic with communist revolutionary cause. So she couldn't care less about this letter. The letter was not unearthed till as late as 1997. And of course, by then, Shenzhongwen had already passed away for more than a decade. And in her final years, Shenzhongwen's wife continuously deplored why I have never tried even to understand Shenzhongwen. And what this difference between 事功 and 有情, that of course becomes a challenge for us to be here to try to appreciate Shenzhongwen's effort at the time. This kind of literature is later described as a kind of literature in the drawers, 抽屉里的文学, because otherwise it would have been confiscated or being, critiqued by the politically very correct critics at the time. And this is a kind of a sort of dangerous statement with regard to the meaning of literature. And then, again, the third case I want to talk about. Shenzhongwen didn't stop with the 1952 contemplation of the meaning and the function of literature. 1961, again, this is a moment he again tried to understand what literature means to this generation of Chinese people. Keep in mind, 1961 marked the final year of the Great Leap Forward. 1961 was also the year that saw the gradual emergence of the consequences of the Great Famine. And today, from our perspective, we surely understand at least 30 million Chinese perished as a result of that famine. And yet, Shenzhongwen picked this time to describe a kind of abstract lyricism. And this is, again, something forbidden. And this is a time when we are really thinking of food. We are thinking of power struggle. We are thinking of another campaign and a revolutionary movement. And Shenzhongwen said, however, we need to think how to abstract values, meanings from this kind of continuum of our everyday life. And how do we do it? Well, through literature, and on top of that, our encounter with everyday artifacts. And this is the point where Shenzhongwen showed his new commitment to art history, the most plebeian kind. Everyday kind of utensils, kind of paraphernalia, or whatever kind of tools, vehicles we come across, we want to cherish these things and try to sense the feeling as invested by people of previous generations. Try to understand why a form was being formulated this and that way. So this particular kind of art object called a literature, called whatever kind of products of handicraftsmanship become the object of his study. The bottom line, if human life changes its constancy, contradiction is constancy, and destruction is constancy. So life is unpredictable. Life is ephemeral. Life is really undependable. So this is the Chairman Mao wouldn't have been happy, of course, to see something like this in 1961. And somehow Shenzhongwen was writing in private, in secrecy. And he talked about the necessity of cultivating this so-called a kind of a history with feeling through feeling, literally feeling the everyday objects, trying to really come to terms with the wisdom, the happiness, the dejection, whatever kind of sort of sensorial kind of responses to the external stimuli in this particular moment. This is how you truly understand the quintessential meaning of your life. So that shows how far he could go, and from our perspective, that's how radical he could sound in the given circumstances. And this essay was never finished. And of course, again, it was hidden somewhere else, and it wasn't rediscovered till the year 1988, the year when Shenzhongwen passed away. So far, I've given 3 examples regarding Shenzhongwen's sort of a critical engagement with literary thought. And this is definitely quite different from the mainstream monolithic the discourse as mandated or prescribed by Chairman Mao and his cohorts. And yet, I want to argue that Shenzhongwen was not just formulating this discourse suddenly out of nowhere or on his own. And when we come to this particular key word of today's lecture, shuching, its English translation is a lyricism or lyrical, which is truly not a perfect equivalent. In the Chinese context, I want to argue that the Chinese phrase shuqing could be dated way back 2,200 years ago to the person who is none other than Qu Yuan. We actually talked about him the other day, the sort of archie poet of traditional Chinese literature. In Qu Yuan's poem 九章, here we have the quote, 习诵以志民兮, 发愤以抒情. Cherishing my plaint, I give sorrow free rein. Venting rancor, I tell of pent-up feelings or thoughts. So even 2,200 years ago, one generation of Chinese literati or intellectuals were already thinking of a shuqing, or in English, lyricism, as a way to engage with history at large. Not just merely kind of a solipsistic kind of a self-indulgence into some sentimental whims. But you write because you write in such a kind of emotional way as to respond to the external stimuli, from politics to cosmic movements. So truly this points to a different kind of a cosmological view of what literature can do, what literature really is. And also, if we look at the shuqing, the kind of a philological survey of the Chinese term shuqing will take us to the understanding that the 2 Chinese characters, first, shu, that means relief, means unravel. or sort of it refers us to zhu. That's a kind of loom in a weaving machine. All right. In other words, when you talk about shuching, the shu, it means you both sort of weave and unravel whatever kind of thoughts or feelings in your mind. If in Western tradition, when we talk about lyricism, we think about the lyre. That's the Greek roots, the musical reference or musical instrument. In the Chinese context, it's the weaving machine that makes better sense to our understanding of shuqing, the shu. And then even more intriguingly, when we come to the word qing or the character qing, today we treat qing as emotion, feeling, affection, or love or whatever. But traditionally, we understand the qing also as a circumstance, as a kind of a situation in which we come to terms with the lived sort of experience. And above, qing means fact or truth. In other words, when Shenzhongwen in 1952 or 1961 was invoking this terminology, shuqing, he couldn't have just meant to think of Lord Byron or Wordsworth or Shelley. In the meantime, he could have also thought about more probably about Qu Yuan and so on and so forth. And how about the kind of imaginary dialogue between Shenzhongwen and the late Ming, early Qing loyalist Huang Zongxi? And he, at one point, had this famous statement, 始亡而后诗作, where history collapses, poetry arises. For those who are familiar with Adorno's famous phrase, after Auschwitz, poetry becomes unlikely. Huang Zongxi, as early as the 17th century, happened to have made a counter-argument. Poetry becomes the only way out. Poetry becomes possible only after history has become untenable. So how do we sort of negotiate such a kind of a sort of a dialectic statement? Maybe we'll just talk about it later. But no matter what, I want to argue that Shenzhongwen in mid-1950s was thinking of the polemic of shuqing because basically he understood he was responding to the grand tradition of shishi, that is poetry as history. This is a Tang Dynasty discourse, which was perfected by the poetry of Du Fu, the so-called the sage of Chinese poetry. So poetry is not just merely a kind of expression of a personal yearnings or feelings. Poetry here has to be understood as a part of a Chinese literary culture, and this kind of engagement, even in the new era of the People's Republic of China, still should make sense to someone like Shenzhongwen. So this is probably the context I want to call attention to. And of course, we can go on and on by tracing out the full trajectories of Shenzhongwen's dialogue with the predecessors of pre-modern Chinese literature. But perhaps I will just stop here for 1 second. What I want to do now is to open up the domain of this literary discourse on the lyrical in mid-20th century. I here just briefly want to bring up 2 names. The first name is Professor Chen Shixiang, who at that time was teaching at UC Berkeley, and again, a political refugee at the time for 1948, 1949. He was trying to think of the future of China, and then he came up with a very bold announcement, or kind of a very provocative announcement, that Chinese literature, or the whole Chinese literary tradition, is nothing but the lyrical tradition. So again, we just ponder why. This is a revolutionary age. This is the so-called epic age. Why someone like Chen Shixiang wanted to argue this way? And what was his motivation? Particularly so if we come to think of his position as a modernist before he left China in 1941. So the motivation of rethinking of the terms of Chinese literature, something we want to think about. And in the interest of time, I probably will just move on to the second figure I would like to introduce, or the contemporary of Shenzhongwen. And this person is Jaroslav Prusak. He actually is Czech sinologist. 1957, when Prusak, he was really a very enthusiastic Marxist. He was really welcoming this new age of revolution in Europe and China and so on and so forth. But the bottom line, he's a wonderful, solid sinologist. He came up with this argument that Chinese literature or the Chinese literary history was definitely taking a progressive move from the pre-modern part to the early modern part, now to the modern part that is revolutionary age. But history, literary history, didn't follow the same kind of parallel sort of a scenario. He wanted to argue that Chinese literary history somehow come to a point where the lyrical and the epic are engaged with each other, sort of having a dialogue. This, again, was a kind of an eccentric observation of the nature of revolutionary literature, because supposedly in 1950s, literature should have already marched to the epic stage. And the Prusak, nevertheless, made a kind of sort of a counter-argument by saying that don't you ever forget that the lyrical constitutes the core of traditional literature. So here, instead of a kind of a sort of a predictable, kind of progressive timeline, this Eastern European or Central European sinologist argued in his own way for a different kind of a look at the nature of Chinese history or literary history. But then we should further open up this sphere of lyrical discourse at the time to think about the lyrical in a global sense. And this is where we have a theory being brought back to our discussion. We ought to keep in mind that the 1950s also saw a great group of Marxist critics from different stances were arguing about the lyrical. Here we have George Lukács in 1957 was still complaining about why European civilization was still deteriorating. To him, the lyrical means something negative, but somehow lyrical was in his mind. He was yearning for the return of the epic age, but somehow nowhere to be seen, that kind of utopian vision. Walter Benjamin, before his suicide, he was actually already pondering how we come to terms with European lyricism in the modern age. So Baudelaire and so on and so forth. And of course, Adorno, again, 1950s, wrote extensively about the so-called negative dialectic of the lyrical in a kind of a new political moment. This is the sort of Cold War moment. So this is the leftist sort of articulations of the lyrical. What about Martin Heidegger? Ever since the early 1940s, he was talking about a kind of poetic turn vis-a-vis the worsening political circumstances in Europe. And of course, during the Second World War period, Martin Heidegger made his own sort of pro-Nazi political choice. And he had a follower, Paul de Man, in 1942 in Belgium, writing anti-Nazi statements and so on and so forth. He eventually went to the United States. Later on, he became a great professor at Yale University, one of the greatest deconstructionists in 1960s and 1970s. When he passed away in 1983, 4 years after his passing, suddenly documents were being sort of rediscovered that he at one time was trying to collaborate with Nazi. And in America, we can think of Clarence Brooks or Ralph Friedman, these critics of new criticism, talking about the very intricate sort of textual reading of this and that. So basically, I'm arguing that 1950s was truly an extraordinary time. This is a moment that witnessed the rise of the Cold War at global scale. This is a time when China was sort of engulfed in continued political struggle, and finally, of course, with the founding of the new republic, People's Republic. And somehow, the term, the lyrical, was like a specter, haunting critics, either in China or in Sinophone communities or overseas. And the argument was still going on in the 1960s and 1970s. So this is my argument, that is Shenzhongwen, in a kind of unwitting manner, sort of made a contribution, his personal contribution to the global sort of dialogue about the pros and the cons of the lyrical in a so-called epic time. And of course, Shenzhongwen's voice was never being heard at the time. And somehow we have to wait for almost 50 years, now to the 21st century, then we finally come to sort of learn what he was trying to do and trying to argue for during this very difficult time. I see that I'm running short of time, so I can either pause here for more questions and answers, and then we probably can further what I haven't finished in the following. So I will just stop here. Okay, thank you.